All right, so today we are talking about recalls. And yes, this does impact you even if you are just starting out. You're a small brand, maybe relying on one contract manufacturer to pump out inventory for you. This does impact you. And we're going to show you an example of that situation where a manufacturer really messed up and all the brands were impacted. So I'm going to show you that. The other thing we're going to dive into is, why do these recalls happen in the first place? What are some examples of reasons as to why these recalls are occurring? We're going to dive into some examples. And then from that, we're going to go into some recalls of the past that I would say caught my attention. Some recall highlights, if you will. We're going to dive into some of the recalls that actually happened in the past for some of these brands and some of the issues, the nuanced issues tied to them and how that could impact you, even if you are relatively small. Maybe you're doing a couple million a year, maybe fairly less than that, but you're seeing sales, you're seeing that momentum. And for those of you that are selling a lot more, well, it's a no-brainer. You need to watch this video if you have no idea about how to execute a recall. And then lastly, how do you prepare for a recall? All right. So there's a lot here. Let's dive into it. So if this is your first time here, my name is Brian, and it's great to meet you. I've been in the supplement space since 2004, specializing in regulatory affairs and quality assurance, and I help supplement brands, functional food brands navigate FDA and FTC, and I want to help you do the same. And if you want to work together, please check out the links in the description down below. All right, so the situation for smaller brands, startups, when I say startups, I'm saying less than, 50 million, let's just say. I know some of you watching this or watching this channel may be brand spanking new, and you may be hesitating like, oh, will this really impact me? And, when we look at the journey for the entrepreneur, typically you're shopping around for a contract manufacturer. You're relying on that contract manufacturer for compliance, right? And the reality, and we're going to dive into this more, is that compliance goes beyond the manufacturer. There's a level of compliance at the brand level that the contract manufacturers cannot fill, nor do they want to. And if you press them on that, they're actually going to admit that, okay? But you'll see later. But for now, I want to show you guys an example of this recall by ABH Natures, which has actually shown how these smaller brands can be impacted by the contract manufacturer, and which is why you can't really rely on them on everything. And there's going to be a situation, and this is a big theme here, is sometimes things happen outside of your control, outside of the contract manufacturer's control, but it still impacts you. It still mandates a recall at the brand level. So let's dive into ABH Nature first. So what happened here? ABH Nature's Products Inc., ABH Pharma Inc., and StockNutra.com issues a nationwide recall of all lots, not just one or two, but all lots of dietary supplement products. So this is essentially anything made by these three companies are under this recall. Now, this recall has been completed and FDA has terminated this recall. And that's because this is dated back in 2020, but it's not that long ago. And what's interesting is you would think back then with NSF certification, GMP certifications, FDA registration, which are all bragging points at the manufacturing level, how the heck did this even happen, right? This isn't 2012. This isn't 2008 anymore. How the heck did this happen? And this was a big one because they violated here. Reason for announcement: products are recalled because of violations of current good manufacturing practice regulations. We're going to dive into the specifics here, but the call out here is there's no foodborne issue, like food illness issue. No one went to the hospital. Let's see if they even talk about that. Yeah. To date, there have been no reported illnesses or injuries as a result of the situation. The FDA inspected and found significant violations of current good manufacturing practice regulations. Manufacturing practices that are not in adequate control represent the possibility of risk being introduced into the manufacturing process, resulting in finished product supplements with decreased identity, purity, strength, and composition. This doesn't even necessarily say that there was an outright non-compliance. It was more like a culmination of things which could increase the risk of some sort of issue happening with the product. And as a result, hey, the recall is happening, okay? There's more background information on the whole situation, but you can see here how you can't rely on the contract manufacturers all the time for compliance, right? What's even more crazy about this recall is the amount of people impacted, amount of brands that were impacted. Essentially, anything that these companies made were under the scope of this recall. And here's what I was able to dig around. So this is through Reddit, and this is the large FDA recall, and here they reveal all the brands that were impacted. So essentially any brand that was made by the ABH Pharma and its company names were impacted. And there's about 800 brands here. It's a lot. And this is the situation, right? If I were an entrepreneur starting out, I'm going to find one manufacturer, Google, Alibaba, whatever the case may be. You're wowed by the sales rep. You go in, put the purchase order, and then bam, they get you inventory. I'm pretty sure none of these brands thought there was an issue. I'm pretty sure they were sold to compliance. They were sold on regulatory review. They were probably sold on everything was fine, that there's testing. Right? Some of these brands, and I'm sure some of these, that they're not asking for test results. Or maybe they are, but it just goes into a file, it goes into an inbox. They're not reviewing it. Right? Because they assume the manufacturer is doing the right tests already. They assume that it would have passed the testing, therefore they shipped it to me, right? Or shipped it to you. They wouldn't have known that there's all these other underlying issues that go behind the scenes. And let's be real, testing is one step of the process, and it's like way late in the process, right? I give the example of the black belt in karate. The black belt test is way, like, if that's the measure of how good you are, I'm sorry, that's way too late, right? How good you are is the years that led up to it. It's the hours you put into it. It's the training. It's the drills. It's the cardiovascular. It's the partner practice and the katas and all these things, the forms practice and the technique. That's what matters. It's not the test. The test is a small component to it. It's important, right? But there's all this stuff that's happening beyond that. And testing can't catch that. And you can see all the brands here. I don't think they would even have known that there was an issue. Some of these brands, I'm sure, could have been old brands that don't exist anymore. Maybe they weren't making product with ABH anymore. Maybe they started initially, but these were just in the records. And so the recall impacted them from that standpoint. But it's a lot. Look at this. The list just keeps going. And you can just quickly see how this stuff can impact the small startup brand to the established brand, right? So yeah, this is crazy. This was a big one. To give you guys more color, this is a blog from Wilson Sonsini. It's a law firm. And here, FDA announces unprecedented recall of supplements. And let's see if they go into a little bit more. The recall is a result of a consent decree entered in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York. The consent decree bars 3 corporations, ABH Natures Products, ABH Pharma, and StockNutra.com, together as ABH. And owner Mohammed Jahirul Islam, aka Islam, from distributing adulterated and misbranded dietary supplements and unapproved and misbranded drugs, and requires defendants to take remedial action, including the recall. Yeah, and then if you dive into it, well, what did they mess up on? Well, they failure to conduct at least one appropriate test to verify the identity of a dietary ingredient, failure to verify that finished batches of dietary supplements meet product specifications for identity, purity, strength, and composition, failure to implement a system of production process controls that covers all stages of manufacturing, packaging, labeling, and holding of dietary supplements to ensure the quality of the dietary supplement, which, by the way, you can see here, packaging and holding is part of the whole manufacturing process. So for those of you that think I can make bulk and then have it packaged somewhere else or relabeled somewhere else, that all those other steps at a different facility needs to be under manufacturing. They need to have the GMP programs, et cetera, because it's all under the scope of manufacturing. Side issue. Failure to include required information in batch records, failure to properly review and investigate a customer complaint. So as you can see here, there was no massive magic bullet. It was a culmination of GMP failures over and over again. And I think really behind it all is a lack of trying to improve, fix, and get better, and address these issues head on. And I think there is gross negligence here. That's kind of what I see it. Because other manufacturers, they could have these observations as well. Some might forget to test one ingredient and that got caught in the audit or whatever. But those manufacturers will fix the issue, fix their procedures to make sure that doesn't happen again and continuously improve. Here, I don't think that happened. But the call out here is there wasn't some severe oversight. It was a culmination of things. And these things you don't really find through testing. And like I said, that's assuming the brand owner is mandating testing on the finished product. Sometimes they just rely on whatever the manufacturer does. They don't even have that conversation with them of how are you testing the product? How are you testing my product? Not just testing like as a general like procedure, but how are you guys testing my product? Because some manufacturers have a great procedure for the large brands, but they don't necessarily implement them for the smaller brands. There wasn't some sort of like silver bullet of here's where the breakdown happened. It was just a whole bunch of things happening. And like I said, the finished product testing that normally we look at isn't going to look into this. You're going to find this through audits. That means visiting them, auditing them with people that knows what to look for. All right. And here's the thing. These brands probably had no idea. And you can tell because of this stuff, which most brand owners don't even look at. They barely look at their own certificate of analysis. Probably don't audit their manufacturers. So there's a lot of issues here, which is why we can't rely on the manufacturer to satisfy compliance. In the early stages, I get why we have to do it because of budget constraints and bandwidth and all that stuff. But my big point here is recalls can happen and you got to be ready for it. Okay, that's the theme for today. All right, you got to be ready for it. It can happen whether it's in your control or not. Okay, all right. So to that point, why do recalls happen anyway? Let's dive into that a little bit. Just taking a quick step back here for a second. As your business grows, staying on top gets harder. And if I was your competition, well, there are 3 ways I'm going to get ahead of you. Number 1, outsell you. Number 2, cut you down. Or 3, both. So how can you circumvent and insulate yourself from all of this? The first is to increase your sales channels, obviously. And the reality here is that you've got one shot with these larger retailers, either online or in store. And you have to be ready from a compliance standpoint to play at their level and reveal your books. Well, that means sharing your specifications, your test results, your ingredient information, maybe sharing your manufacturing qualification process and other quality and compliance related information. The other thing, perhaps not so obvious, is that your competition is already exploring ways to cut you out. We're already seeing brands being flagged by Amazon so that the product is wrongfully delisted. Or maybe these competitors are submitting complaints to the National Advertising Division. Or in some instances, these competitors are sending cease and desist letters and having their legal teams go after brands for not being in compliance with FDA. And if you're watching this and saying, Brian, we have third-party tested everything. Well, I'm going to counter and say, show me your stability data or show me your structure function notifications to the FDA. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, and if I was the lawyer going after you, well, I got you exactly where I want you. The fact is that when your business is successful, the bar of compliance from a practical matter shifts. And what got you by before at launch is not what's going to get you by now. And it's important to know where you stand and what needs to get fixed today, which is why I recently launched Supplement Compliance Checkup, aka SEC, for the brands that have already launched and are seeing success, and they want to get a more accurate read of where they stand against FDA requirements. We've loaded it with our proprietary compliance vulnerability checklist, as well as a detailed walkthrough of specific protocols to handle recalls and customer complaints, all built from hands-on experience. And we've included other bonuses worth over $750. Check out the links in the description down below for more information to Supplement Compliance Checkup to make sure that your brand is protected and secured for long-term sustainable growth. All right, back to the video. So what are the underlying issues behind recalls? Why are brands executing recalls? What are they getting recalled for, right? Poorly worded question, but you get the intent here. And so here are just some examples, all right? So Desert Holdings issues allergy alert on undeclared tree nut allergen in favorite day. Gourmet New York style cheesecake, okay? So This one is an allergy issue, but in particular, a labeling allergy issue. They didn't declare the nut allergen, the tree nuts, right? Now, there's a couple ways you could look at this. Number one is if they labeled it right, there wouldn't be a recall, right? And the other thing, and I think this happens a lot, is that the typical brand owner who's starting out, they probably don't understand how the allergens are introduced into the product inadvertently or more intentionally sometimes. But when we talk about inadvertent introduction, how could that even happen? When we're formulating, typically we think of allergens in terms of the ingredients themselves. So if I have spinach in my product or broccoli or pea protein, I wouldn't really think that there would be allergens. So therefore, I never have the question or concern of whether there should be an allergen in my product. As a result, I don't label that, my product contains XYZ allergens, okay? Which is an issue because allergens can show up not through the ingredient itself, but the sub-ingredients. So the ingredients within the ingredients, spinach powder, natural flavors, different coatings, vitamins, minerals. In order for it to be the finished ingredient, not the finished capsule product, but the ingredient itself, sometimes you have to pair these active ingredients with other like inactive ingredients in order for it to stabilize, in order for it to be a powdered form, all right? So that it can be manipulated in an encapsulation machine or a filling machine or a filler, and so they can run in the machine smoothly. There's other excipients, other ingredients. Those other ingredients could have allergens or be exposed to allergens, all right? So there's that introduction through the supply chain, through the ingredient itself. And then furthermore, it could be introduced at the manufacturing level. You have the employees that didn't control. They went from a room with an allergen and then to the room making your allergen-free product. Or they used the gloves that touched an allergen, right? And then now they're touching your product. So it could be introduced at the manufacturing level. And then you can replicate that. Well, it's not just the manufacturer of your supplement. It could be the manufacturer of the ingredients. And then you multiply that by how many ingredients you have. So you can have introduction of allergens across the supply chain, plus the manufacturing level, plus the ingredient level. It's a lot. And as a result, you really have to hone in with the manufacturer and talk about the allergens in your product. Okay. But this is a very, very common example. You see that all the time. You probably read about it in the news a lot. That is a very common one. And we can't assume that just because our product on the surface doesn't look like it's got ingredients with a certain allergen, like we're not using peanuts, we're not using almonds, we're not using sesame, we can't assume that means that our product is allergen free. Okay, we can't. You don't want to make that claim, by the way. There's a lot of risks, and those that worked with me know exactly what I'm talking about, all right? So that's one example. Let's go on to the next one. Nestle USA announces a voluntary recall of a limited quantity of lean cuisine and stuffer's, frozen meals due to potential presence of foreign material. So what is foreign material? It could be anything that's not supposed to be in there. It could be a leaf, a botanical leaf. It could be a plastic glove, a bit of a plastic glove. But from a safety issue, it could be also like, fecal matter. It could be a piece of metal, it could be a piece of wire, it could be a piece of glass. And it does get introduced through the manufacturing process. Like if you think about powders, right? Or even a capsule, you want to, some manufacturers will sieve it. They'll want to make sure that the powders are fine. So they sieve it. They run it through a sieve. Well, that sieve over time will deteriorate. It gets old, it gets worn down. And sometimes the sieve breaks off and a piece of that wire gets into the blend. There you go, foreign material. It's in there. And it's up to the manufacturer to screen for those things and to put the checks in. But that's just an example. And we're talking about Nestle. Like this is a big company. They got big influence. They have a quality program. They're probably using contract manufacturers that they audit all the time. And yet they're going through that. So if they're going through that, just imagine what the smaller brands and smaller contract manufacturers are going through. Okay. So, but that's another example, at least to give you, like we're going to dive into some other examples too, but just to give you an example of how recalls happen, right? The foreign material gets caught in there. If you talk about the plastic glove or like a hard plastic, that's hard to detect. There's no metal detectors aren't going to work. X-rays might catch it, but it's a might. So yeah, you could have issues here. And like I said, this is out of your control. And so you have to be ready for these oh crap moments. That's what I call them anyway. OCMs, oh crap moments, right? Okay, let's go to the next one. So you got Sea Bear Company recalls smoked salmon chowder and alehouse clam chowder because of a possible health risk. So what could that be? I haven't looked into this, but I'm going to just guess. Maybe it's a toxin. Maybe the clams are bad, right? Maybe it's a salmonella issue, a bacterial issue. It's quite possible. And what's interesting with bacteria, that stuff can spread. Man, it can spread. It could come from a very innocent place and just spread throughout the facility, and no one ever really noticed it or caught it. Even though you're cleaning and stuff, it can hide in crevices, and then one day it just shows up. All right, in inventory and testing. And even then, it's hard to find it in testing sometimes. Okay, so like this is how complex or nuanced things can get. Let's give the example of the typical production worker. All right, we're training them to gown up, PPE, hairnet, mask if applicable, gloves, and the whole gown. Right. Now, when you and I wear gloves at home, or we're working on the project, we're working in the garage, we wear gloves to do what? To protect our hands, right? We're protecting our hands. That's the intention of the glove, okay? We don't want to get dirty, you don't want to stink, smell, or whatever it is, or protect our skin, whatever the case may be, right? But when we're working on food, we don't wear the gloves to protect our hands. We wear gloves to protect the food. And it's a complete mind shift and behavior shift that sometimes and oftentimes is very hard for the production workers to get because you fall back into the habit. And it could be automatic. Like this is years of conditioning of how we wear gloves, right? Now you got this job in the production team and now you have to retrain your brain. And sometimes these procedures, they just tell you what to do, but they don't tell you why it's important. And a lot of the times they don't tell you why. And so you can see production workers, what they'll do is they'll sneeze on their glove by accident and then they just continue working. They don't know, I got to go change gloves because they're not thinking about protecting the food. They're thinking about protecting their hands. Well, I didn't get my hands dirty from the sneeze. I keep going. And you see that again. If you think about protecting the food, it's a very different mindset. So sometimes, a utensil falls on the floor, and they pick it back up and they put it on the table. All right. And then that table is theoretically contaminated. Whether they use that spoon or not, let's just say they put that spoon on the table, but that table is for food contact stuff. And they realize, oh, okay, that spoon actually fell. Let me just move that spoon away. Now that table still has that dirt, the germs on there from the floor, but people are putting stuff on the table, other clean utensils. They're putting other equipment on there. They're putting containers on there, and then they put that on the line. And now you're slowly spreading that germs out further and further. And like I said, all you need is one bug to find its way into a little crevice that is hard to clean, hard to maintain, hard to get to. And now you've got yourself over time and more runs, growth. And like I said, sometimes the testing catches it, sometimes it doesn't. And like, how can you not catch it, Brian? Well, I'm going to scare you guys a little bit, but this is the reality, okay? You can have, let's just take two situations. A vial with liquid in there. Where'd my hand go? Okay, vial with liquid in there. And then you've got a powder tub, okay? If I drop salmonella in that liquid vial, it's going to mix for the most part throughout the solution, right? And so it's going to be evenly distributed within that liquid. But if I drop some salmonella into the powder, it might not mix, right? Unless I'm physically mixing it. So you could have like these hotspot contaminations. And, if you're not mixing it, you're not thoroughly distributing it, it just stays in that one spot, right? Now, this is in your pile of powder. Now, just remember, a 5,000 unit run, a 10,000 unit run, now you got a huge pile of powders or a whole bunch of units. Now, the one you send to the lab, which sample are you going to send? You're going to take a subset of those powders and send it to the lab. It might not scoop the one area that had the salmonella in it. So the testing tests fine. That happens. More commonly, you sometimes have the wrong test method. Maybe you have analytical error. You have human error. The analyst messes up. Just luck of the draw. It didn't show up. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why sometimes the testing does not find stuff. Now, I'm not trying to freak you guys out. You need all these upstream compliance efforts tied to it. But I'm just showing you how, again, things can trigger a recall even with all the best efforts that you've had, you know what I mean, that you've put in place, you yourself, finding the right manufacturer. It could be out of fluke and it still triggers the recall. So that's, one example. We're going to go dive into some examples actually right now. I'm going to show you some other reasons, but essentially, the definition of a recall, the way they word it is essentially it's like a violation of the regulations. That's it. So there's no like specific, it has to be someone getting sick. It has to be a salmonella issue. It has to be an E. coli issue. No, it doesn't have to mandate that. You could recall for a whole bunch of reasons. And in fact, Canada will actually make you recall products if it tests over the upper limit. So let's just say you have a creatine gummy. Creatine gummies is fresh in mind. I just had a call. And you have 5 grams of creatine per gummy. And if you are over the upper limit, let's just say your upper limit is, 5.5 grams of creatine. If you're over that, even though you're over delivering to the customer, they could recall. FDA, Health Canada has done that. And theoretically, FDA, because of how broad that language is, could do the same. But we're not seeing that much from FDA. But right now, I'm just letting you know how broad this language is. So anyway, let's dive into some examples of recalls that has caught my eye in the past. Okay, so this is an interesting one. This is fairly recent, January 27th, 2025. Okay, New York Wholesale Group, Zara Herbals, Shatavari powder is recalled because of a possible health risk. If we dive into it, what is the health risk? Product may be contaminated with elevated levels of lead. May be contaminated. Not that it is, but it could be. And so, this is interesting. And in particular, because you don't normally see recalls tied to lead, at least in the supplement space. There's a couple things here, good learnings. Number one, I believe this is a Shilajit material, and Shilajit typically has higher lead levels. So you should be testing your heavy metals, especially if it's Shilajit. But people working with me know how frequent I like to test for heavy metals, from a Prop 65 standpoint, as well as just general food safety. But sometimes these manufacturers, they don't test for heavy metals at all, don't want to. I've been in that situation I'm talking about NSF certified facilities are like, no, we're not doing it. Or like other GMP certified UL, Eurofins, no, we're not doing it. It's our own policy to not test for heavy metals. I've seen that. Just because they don't want to know. Can you believe it? I wouldn't have, but I've experienced it myself. And I'm like, on these calls with their quality department, just in awe. And I'm like, why am I having this conversation right now? Anyway, this is interesting because, like I said, this seems to be unique in the sense that you don't normally see lead being recalled as the reason for the recall. No illnesses have been reported to date. So they're doing this out of, the right thing to do, but I'm pretty sure there's other things that have driven this. But yeah, you can get a sense. This is an interesting one, and you should have your product tested on a regular basis for heavy metals, just knowing this space. And like I said, you just never know what you're going to get until you test. So you should, if anybody needs to know, it's you as the business owner, as the entrepreneur, you need to know, okay, where your product falls. And then from there, you can determine, do we reformulate? Do we change manufacturers? Do we change our supply chain? Then you can work with that. If you don't know, look in the other direction. That's even worse. Okay. So let's move on to the next example here. So this one here, U-Dream Full Night contains a hidden drug ingredient. That's why it was recalled. This is back in 2019. And I remember this was big, especially in Canada. U-Dream is a Canadian company. Health Canada actually found the issue. So U-Dream Full Night contains a substance structurally similar to azipiclone and zopiclone. Azipiclone is the active ingredient in the FDA-approved prescription drug Lunesta. So this product was contained this hidden drug ingredient, which means that the product is adulterated, and it was recalled by Health Canada. They tested it. I'll tell you what happened. So this particular manufacturer, they were importing it from China. So by the way, those of you that want to use a Chinese supplier, you guys know how I feel about that. Typically, it's a no-go, especially for starters. But if you are growing and you want to explore, that's different. If you have the money to properly vet. Typically, I don't recommend it. And every time it crosses the border, it's going through some level of enforcement. Okay. And so in this case, Health Canada tested the product at the border. And I think what drove that were customer complaints and also the issue of this product worked really, really well. And I think the customer complaints tied to that, like how drowsy they really were. And so they tested it, they found this drug ingredient. And so they issued the recall. It made huge headlines in Canada because this was being sold in all the retailers, all the big stores. And then they notified FDA, and FDA recalled this product. And yeah, that was crazy. And, from what I understood, the manufacturer, the owner, they're a small startup, small company, a few people running the show. I'm sure they were doing very, very well because, like I said, they were in all the retail, the Walmarts or whatever, the big stores, right? In Canada, at least. And then they were buying the raw materials, I believe, or the finished product from China. And, when you look at those documents, it's just like lemon balm or whatever the typical herbal ingredients, but they're not disclosing this particular drug ingredient. And now, I don't know if they knew about that or if, they intentionally directed the manufacturer to do stuff or what, or the manufacturer just themselves did it. But that's the thing with these manufacturers, especially the ones overseas, you just don't know what you're going to get. You can't, because that's what you're going to do. You're going to talk to people on WhatsApp. You're going to talk to these guys on WhatsApp at a different time zone. They're going to say yes to everything to get the sale. They don't, when you really press them on the testing and the FDA stuff, they don't really know. At least that's been my experience with these overseas manufacturers. And when I say overseas, I'm talking about China. But they're really great at saying yes to everything until you really press them. And they're like, oh, no, we don't do that. And they ghost you all the time. It's just, this is just how it is. So anyway, these guys got caught. And, it might seem on the surface like, so what? They lost some sales. It's like, yeah. But also they lost a lot of trust with the retailers. So they're starting from scratch. They have to redo their supply chain. They have to rebrand themselves. And on top of it, they're used to Chinese prices. So good luck trying to move into Canada or US. Yeah, this was a tough one for them. So they have to like essentially start from scratch. They don't have the distribution anymore. So there's zero sales, maybe whatever's online, but then the reputation and the amount of the publicity they're getting from the recall was really high. So it's a tough one. And if, here's the thing, if their rationale is, I didn't know, and I didn't know what the manufacturer was sending us, or we didn't have any agreements in place, and we didn't have any expectations in place. Well, what's the corrective action? What would you fix? First of all, we need to vet the manufacturer better. We have to go visit them. We have to go talk to them. We have to set proper agreements in place. We have to test the product. Well, guess what? The feedback would typically be, well, we can't afford that. We've got no sales now. Well, we can't afford this. We can't afford that. Yeah, that's the problem with these recalls. That's why you want to avoid that. You want to build a great business from scratch properly so that you can fix this, and have the money to address these corrective actions if need be, and to build these costs into the operations. And they obviously struggled here, at least in my opinion. Maybe they're better now. I don't know. This was back in 2019. And like I said, yeah, that was an interesting one for sure. Okay, I remember this one. Now, this was in all my feeds. It was in my Apple News. Daily Harvest recall, how a rare new ingredient sent customers to the ER. The CEO speaks for the first time about the Terra flower that sickened hundreds, led to lawsuits, and revealed big problems in food safety. Yeah, this one was big because, when I was reading it and going through, I'm like, I get where the breakdown happened. Okay, let me give you some backstory here. So what happened was they used Terra flower in their product, and they started getting complaints, people vomiting, and it just kind of snowballed into an issue, and they ended up issuing this recall. And then FDA went in there, and one of the things that they identified was like, Terra flower isn't really in the food supply. We don't know if it's something that you can even eat, if it's safe to eat, all right? That's kind of the issue here. And so when you go back to the typical brand owner journey, usually we want to formulate a product that's cool, right? That's trending, that's leading edge. So some people might be listening to podcasts and think of the ingredient they speak and like, okay, I want to make my version of that, or I'm going to do that first. So whether that's like a BPC 157 or something really cool and crazy, or some other GLP-1 type product, they're going to be making that. Now, if it were me, my first question is, that sounds like a really cool ingredient, but is that even allowed? That's question number one. Is it allowed in the formula? Is it allowed in supplements? Is it allowed in foods? That's question number one, right? Super obvious, but because we hear people talking about it and it was done in a study, we assume it's allowed in foods, but that's not the case. In the food side of things, and supplements are a subset of foods, you're allowed to use ingredient if it's a grandfathered ingredient, it's a normal food ingredient that's been in the food supply for a very long time. If it has GRAS status, or if it's a new dietary ingredient, meaning it's an NDI, new dietary ingredient, as been defined by the FDA requirements for dietary supplements, and that NDI, new dietary ingredient, has been notified. There's a submission you have to go through with the FDA. It's a notification, NDIN, a new dietary ingredient notification has been submitted to the FDA, and they've reviewed that. Then those ingredients are allowed in your product. In the case of TerraFlower, they didn't go through that. And I can see the typical person just like, oh, well, we know that it's been used in another culture, another country, and maybe it was for a different purpose, but they're putting it in their product. Happens all the time. And guess what? Manufacturers aren't screening for this stuff. They just do what you tell them. They're not going into GRAS a lot of the time. Some good ones will. But a lot of the times, they're just doing what you tell them to do, and the responsibility falls on you. That's how they view this. So in the case of TerraFlower, it wasn't in the food supply. And the question then became like, is this allowed? Are we allowed to put it in our product? And in this article, I believe the CEO does talk about how their own internal experts felt that TerraFlower was permitted. I don't know if that's true or what led to that decision. They obviously aren't disclosing that, but the behind the scenes discussions, the boss is the boss. And sometimes the boss says, you know what? I don't agree with the QA guys or the food safety guys. We're just doing it. Not uncommon. And so here we are, right? And so anyway, FDA said, look, we're going to go look into TerraFlower and see, is it allowed? Is it safe for use in foods? Here's their decision. FDA declares TerraFlower unsafe 2 years after the outbreak. So this is a huge blow to that brand. But I suspect they probably have reshifted their supply chain to move away from TerraFlower. That's probably the case. But you can just see here how sticky this situation is. And the first question should have been, is TerraFlower permitted? And if it's a little bit gray, I would probably just decide to move away from it. But, it is what it is. But the learning here is you don't know. Let's just assume that their food safety people did review it and said, you know what, it's fine. They don't know until you try. But for the most part, the data that's available says that it's safe. That's also legitimately possible. But then once you mass produce and maybe at a different dosage level than what was previous, than what the studies available, whatever is available, who knows what kind of studies were available. It's a very different situation when you go to market with your specific product, and maybe there's something there. And that's what really triggered this. So yeah, it's just unfortunate, but this is just another really good example. I remember this catching my eye. So yeah, recalls can happen. And like I said, these are things that are sometimes out of your control. When you look at this stuff, okay, well, I can control what goes into my formula. I cannot use TerraFlower. I can control the manufacturer. I could look for a better manufacturer or right. But like I said, there's only so much way you can give you these certifications, but it's a starting point. I get it. But you can control that. You can somewhat control some ingredients that you want to bring in. The big one is the supply chain. The supply chain is very convoluted. Sometimes the supply chain isn't following the rules. And that's harder to suss out, right? Like I said, I talked about the manufacturing GMPs for your product. All those requirements needs to be at the ingredient level too. And how is that being checked? Because FDA is not really going after those guys. So there's that issue, right? Because really FDA and FTC, they're really concerned about the end user, the consumer. But when you go upstream in the supply chain, that's not really the end user. It's almost B2B, right? So there's that. And then in some cases, these manufacturers, these ingredient suppliers, they have issues. Oh, crap, we got to issue a recall, failed testing, what have you, but they've already made your product. And your product is using that implicated lot of the raw material. Now you are impacted. Happens. And you use the best supplier, You use the best manufacturer. You've formulated the best possible. You work with Brian on everything else. You know what I mean? And you still have to go through the recall. And one thing to note here is that the recalls are really driven by the brand. It's not driven by the manufacturers. If we go back to this slide, it's Nestle that's doing the recall. It's not their contract manufacturers, right? Sea Bear is the one that's doing the recall, not their contract manufacturer. So you are the one that's going to be executing the recall, not your contract manufacturer. The contract manufacturer doesn't want the publicity. They don't want the FDA recording them as the one tied to the recall. That's how it's going to be. Now, they'll help you with the recall, but they don't want to be the one doing the recall, and neither do you. You don't want the manufacturer to speak on your behalf. Typically, the brand wants to be the one speaking. They're the ones talking to the customer. They're the ones creating the press release. They're the ones that's owning up to the responsibility, which is why the brand owner needs to figure out what is the recall procedures, how to execute, and you're the one that's working with the FDA, not the contract manufacturer. You cannot rely on them. Sometimes in the fine print, as well, in the contracts, they're going to say, you're responsible for executing the recall. We'll help you, but you're the one that's responsible for that. And it just makes the most sense. But also, to that point, I would argue that, when you work with these manufacturers and you ask them the question, have you had any recalls? They'll say no. I don't think that's a true answer. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the answer is kind of like maybe, because some of the brands actually underwent a recall as a result of the contract manufacturer's screw up. But because the brand is the one that led the recall, it's not recorded in the database. It's not public information. So it's not really the manufacturer that's recalling, it's actually the brand. So in the manufacturer's eyes, they've had no recalls, right? Yeah. So anyway, so you as a brand owner, you have to be ready. You have to be ready, just like us being ready for fire drills, earthquake drills, having insurance, life insurance and LTD, long-term disability and all that. We got to have some things in place. And you have to do the same from a recall standpoint. All right. So what can you do as a brand owner today, right? Even if you're small, when I say small, less than 50 million, less than 25 million. Some are doing $5-10 million in sales, fine. But you might not understand what the recall requirements are, which is, I would argue, is quite dangerous. And others may be like, dude, I just launched yesterday. You want me to have a recall process? All right, well, maybe you're okay for now, for the next 6 months. But if those of you who are selling, you launched a year ago, you're seeing momentum, you're seeing the sales, you're seeing potential success, you're seeing the path to success, I think it's time for you to start considering the recall process, right? At least so you know what to expect, to be trained up for that so that you can execute. And you don't come off as a novice, especially when working with FDA. And in my opinion, you want a smooth recall, an uneventful one. That's the measure of a successful recall. I've been a few. And when it's uneventful, no one makes a big deal out of it. That's when you know things went well, okay? So what can you do as a brand owner? So the first thing that you can do is keep an eye on recalls, right? You can sign up for FDA's email list to get notifications of recalls. I think that's really easy to do and something that I encourage you guys to do because, hey, maybe one of your competitor gets a recall and that's good information for you. But also, maybe there's a manufacturer or supplier, ingredient supplier that gets recalled and at least you know about it. Yes, they're supposed to notify you, but do they always? Not a lot. So that's something to keep in mind, all right? So it's good that you sign up for it. You can also search through their database just to see what are the types of recalls? How do they language it? What are they getting recalled for? I think that's really important as well. Just being aware of that, I think, is a really good start so that you are somewhat in the loop, all right? You're not caught off guard if there is an issue that could impact you. Like I said, the FDA does expect you to know how to execute a recall. It's a bad day if you don't, right? Because now they don't trust what you tell them. They might send people over. It just gets uglier and they're just a lot more hands-on. If they get a sense that you know what you're doing, then they let you execute the recall for the most part on your own, which is great. That's what you want. But they expect you to have the appropriate procedures in place. And I'd strongly recommend that you have an SOP. And one thing you can do is you can look at FDA's guidance to help you with that standard operating procedure. So here you have an industry guidance for recalls. There's some good ones here. They've got a Q&A regarding mandatory food recalls. Now, just so you know, when you talk about mandatory food recalls, that means FDA had to escalate through the proper channels to force you to do a recall. Therefore, it's mandatory. All the other recalls that you see in the news typically are voluntary recalls, but essentially it's more like you're voluntold. You know what I mean? FDA saw this or something got caught, you got a recall. Now, they're not going to go through the official channels because the brand voluntarily went with the recall. That's why they called voluntary food recalls. But I think that would be a good starting point. Another good one is this industry recall guidance. You could take a look at that as well. The call out here is that a lot of this information is somewhat technical in jargon. And if you are writing up your SOP, you probably want someone that can properly vet that out just to make sure everything's on the right track. But this is the starting point. This is about educating yourself, and then you can write your standard operating procedure so that you know what information to collect, who to go to, what your time frames are. All these things are important so that when you do get in contact with the FDA, you know what you're doing. But the drawback here is, well, it's technical information. Now you kind of learn all this and understand their language, which I think is somewhat of a challenge, which leads us to another option. And this is the option that I like. And that is this program, our supplement compliance checkup. This is a new one. We're super excited about this. This is where I get to geek out a little bit and talk more about compliance. This was really formulated to help brands protect themselves. They get a snapshot of where they are from a compliance standpoint at the brand level. Like I hinted to earlier, the contract manufacturer only does so much. There's another layer of compliance that will need to complement the manufacturer. All right. Yes, we are going to rely on the manufacturer for a lot. There are some risks there tied to that, which we talked about already. But there's other stuff that the brand needs to do. And one of that is the recall SOP. But before you get into all that, this program dives into a lot more. We're talking about how to see your brand operationally in terms of compliance. Are you guys capturing everything? What are some of your vulnerabilities? Also, what are the external pressures? Who's going after you? Who's looking at you? Who wants to tear you down? And I'm not talking about FDA and FTC. I think that's important for you as the brand, as well as the internal issues that we see over and over again, the same mistakes on an operational standpoint. What do brands get wrong over and over again? So like I said, this is more for the established brands. Like if you just started a day ago, obviously this won't apply for you, but if you're starting to see success, you're starting to see consistent sales, I think this would be a great program for you because now you get a sense of where you stack up and what you need to aim for over the next 6 to 9 months, 6 to 12 months. Plus, you get the recall SOP. And I'm not just throwing you an SOP. I think that's a dumb way to do it. It's about walking you through the SOP and educating you as to how a recall actually works. What does FDA want? What are the things outside of that guidance document that matters due to my practical experience? What makes it smoother? What makes it better? And you understand the mechanism of the recall. I think that's way more important than the actual SOP, but you're getting both. All right. Lots here, all right, that we built in. Like I said, there's more for the established brands. For those other brands, making new SET is, and if you haven't launched yet, the supplement startup essential training program, that's better for you. But anything past that, this is the way to go. And you get some bonuses. So I'll throw that in there too. So over, what was it, $799 of value. All right, there you go. So yeah, lots. We're diving into a lot there. We're getting into the more geeky stuff, but you need to so that you're properly prepared to deal with some of these oh crap moments. All right, lots there. Anyway, that's it for today for recalls. I mean, maybe we'll do more of an in-depth recall thing, but I'm trying to keep this as high level as possible and watchable as possible. Thank you so much for sticking through this. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers.